Now
Just
we are.
got it. Okay, perfect. So the first thing we're going to do if we want to be presenting at a conference is to start with the abstract. And so depending on the conference, they'll have different guidelines for what that looks like. And so the guidelines that I'm going to tell you about are specific for the LSMRC annual conference. The deadline for which to submit the abstract is right around the corner. So first we'll start out with the timeline. So typically a conference is going to have a specific deadline that you have to meet to submit your abstract. And so for the LSMRC annual conference, that's going to be 11:59 p.m. September 22nd, which is just a few days from now. We are at September 19th. And so this is on Friday that this is going to be due. And you have to make sure that you submit by the deadline. The other thing to keep in mind is that sometimes, late at night when lots of people are trying to submit, those portals can get crashed or have difficulties. So you don't want to be there at 11:58 trying to submit and find out that, you couldn't get it submitted. So make sure you do this early. And also, in hours where that there can be IT to help support you or other folks behind the scenes to support you. So really, back this deadline up, pretend that it is 5 p.m. at the very, very latest, maybe 4, so that way you make sure that you get this in and are able to be considered. Once you've submitted your abstract, a conference will give you a notification of whether or not your abstract has been accepted. And so the LSMRC conference is actually phenomenal that they have a 1-week turnaround time. So you have hardly any wait at all before you actually get to find out whether your abstract has been accepted. So within the week, you'll find out. And then your job then, if your abstract has been submitted or been accepted by the conference, is that you have to confirm that you do plan to participate and attend that conference in person. And so for LSMRCE, October 2nd is the deadline for you to confirm that you will be participating, which means that you plan to show up in person at the conference on November 3rd through 5th. And so that's what that looks like. Every conference is different in kind of the timeline of what they have for this, but these are the general steps that you would expect to see once you submit an abstract. You submit, wait to find out if it's been accepted. If it's accepted, you have to confirm that you're going to go, and then you actually show up. So that's pretty typical. And then we're going to talk a little bit about formatting. Again, this is specific to LSMRCE, but many of these things apply to any abstract that you would submit. And so they request that you use Times New Roman, Arial, or Calibri. Typically, Times New Roman is going to be kind of your standard go-to for your font choice. You're going to want 11-point font is their suggestion. 11 or 12 is pretty typical of any abstract that you would be submitting. 250 words maximum for that abstract body. And we'll talk about what the abstract body is in just a little bit. But that's for the LSMRCE conference, 250 words maximum. And so you can, if you write your abstract in a Word document, you can select the whole thing, the abstract body portion, use tools, and then word count. And it'll tell you how many words that you actually have so that you can make sure that you're not going over that maximum. Sometimes the actual submission form will count the number of words and tell you how many you're over or how many words you have left, but it really just depends on the conference. Typically, an abstract is going to range anywhere from 200 to about 300 words. So 250 is right there in the average for what LSMRC is asking for their annual conference. But just to give you the idea, there is a range. My students and I just submitted one that was 200 words. And so trying to get down to 200 words is really hard. Just to keep in mind that every conference that you go to is going to have slightly different requirements for formatting and what they're expecting. In your abstract, you're not going to use all caps. So this is going to be normal sentence text that you're using within the abstract. And we'll talk a little bit more on a few specific portions of the abstract that have more specifics around capitalization. But the general body of your abstract is just going to be written in a normal sentence type structure where the first word of the sentence is capitalized and the rest are all lowercase. Unless it needs to be capitalized because it's a formal thing or a name of something. And then within our abstract, we're going to have 5 different sections. Again, this is pretty standard. The only one that's sometimes optional, depending on the conference, is the acknowledgments here. But otherwise, these are all going to be what you would find in any abstract that you're going to submit for a conference. So the first thing is your title. And so you want to keep your title is going to be as succinct as you can make it. Sometimes that's really hard in STEM, but as succinct as we can make it, that still gets at the point of what the study was, so that folks could look through those titles and see, oh, maybe this is a project that I'm interested in. I'd want to stop by and see this poster. You're going to include the authors. So that'll include you as the person who is presenting, and then any co-authors that are part of the study who worked on this project in addition to you. And then, of course, you'll also want to include your faculty mentor or your PI. You're going to include the affiliation. So that's what department and institution that you're at, as well as all of your co-authors. And we'll see that in an example coming up. And then the body. So the body is basically the main part of the abstract. That's going to be the what you did, right? So that's going to give you an overview of what that project is. It's kind of a condensed version of your entire research project, summed down into 250 words or less. And then lastly, the acknowledgements. The acknowledgements are typically going to be funding sources. It could also be somebody who contributed to the project, but maybe wasn't an author. So occasionally we have some folks who contribute to the project, but they didn't do enough to warrant authorship, or they were kind of tangentially related. But typically this acknowledgement section for a poster is just going to be the funding sources. So things like Indiana LSAMP is going to be on there because they funded your project for you to be able to do this work. Okay, so here I have a real life abstract. This is from my lab, from my research lab, from one of my students, Ann Martin. So this is a recent one that we submitted for a conference for her work that she's been working on over the last year and a half in my lab. And so I want to go through just all the different components of what this abstract is. I don't expect you to read through it. We will get into the body of it and really look at what each of these components are. But I want to kind of highlight the high level pieces of the abstract. So the first is my mouse will work. Here is the title. So I told you I'd come back to this idea of the capitalization in the example. And so here, when we're doing the titles, we do capitalize all of the words except for prepositions or things like a or an, unless they're at the start. And so we do this kind of every word capitalization for our titles, typically in the sciences. Sometimes it's all caps for the titles. LSMRC has specifically asked for not all caps. So we want this capitalization of every word for the title for our LSMRC abstract submission. And then the second piece is our authors. So we're going to have our authors listed here. You'll note that here, Anne, who's my student, whose project that is working on this, she is the presenting author. So she's the one who would present at the conference on this work. And so her name is in bold and it's also listed first. So you all who are writing the abstract, your name will be the first one listed and you'll put it in bold. And then you're also going to want to include your PI or research mentor. Make sure that they are comfortable being listed on your abstract, but also they're going to be the ones who have to sign off on it. So you want to make sure that they have that they've agreed to for you to submit your abstract. You'll also notice here, I didn't put my doctor title and I didn't put my PhD title. Actually, this is Dr. Balcom and Dr. Butcher, two of my collaborators on this project. I don't list their doctor titles or their PhDs here in the abstract. We just list first and last name. You could also include middle initial. That'd be fine if the authors choose to have that. But that's a kind of a stylistic choice if you want to include that middle initial or not. The other thing you'll note here is I do have these superscripts here. And so those superscripts are going to be matched up with the affiliations. So that's going to be our departments and our institutions that we are at. And so that's the next component of that is the author affiliations. So here you see that these are going to match up for each of the folks. So Anne here has a 1. She is part of our Department of Natural Sciences at Northeastern State University. That's our home institution. You see that my Lauren, Madison, and I, and Dr. Balcom all are also at that institution and in that same department. So all of those are going to have a 1 next to them. So we don't have to list a new one just because we have new authors. So we just do it once for all of them that are in the same department and same institution. And then you'll see Dr. Butcher is my example, one of my collaborators. He has a 2 and a 3. So he's actually at Oklahoma State University, and he's also a member of the Harold Ham Diabetes Center, which is at OU Health Science Center. And so, so those affiliations are listed there, and then they correspond here. So we can see that those are going to correspond. I'm also a member of the Harold Ham Diabetes Center, so I also have a 3 listed there. And so we see those matching up with the list of the authors and then the affiliations. And then this big chunk of text is our body. This is going to be where we have our 250 word limit. And we'll dive into the kind of components of the body of the abstract coming up, but this is where we would have our 250 word limit. So whenever you're trying to check to make sure that you're within those word limits, you would highlight that portion in Word again. You go to Tools and then you select word count to find out where you're at. And then our last section of our abstract is our acknowledgments. And again, that's primarily going to be funding sources. It may also include some individuals if there are folks who helped you. We've had times where we've acknowledged, say, our science librarian who helped us with some research on literature search in preparation to do projects or things like that. We've also had folks that maybe an animal facility where folks are really helping us to support our project, but they really were not contributing directly to the project and the science of it, but kind of the support in the background. So there's any number of folks that you might want to thank in there, but your PI and your faculty mentor are really going to be the folks that'll help guide this. And so you, of course, are going to list Indiana LSAMP as one of those acknowledgments for providing funding for you for this research, but you also want to make sure that your PI's funding sources for the project are also included. So you can see in mine, this project is supported by the NIH by a grant that I have through Oklahoma Embry, and then it's also supported by a career development award I have through my professional organization, and then Oklahoma Lewis Stokes for Alliance for Minority Participation, because Anne is an LSAMP scholar at our institution. And so all of those are listed here in the acknowledgments. Oops, I get that. Okay, so we'll take a look at the abstract body. So there's a couple different components of it that we're going to see traditionally in any abstract. And so we'll kind of go through those looking at this. This is the same example. I've just pulled the text over to the side so I can kind of highlight it and go along and show you some of the components of it. So the first thing is that for LSMRCE, there's going to be 250 word max. So don't forget that. You've got to start there and then go from there. And so here in this blue section that I've highlighted, essentially what this portion is doing is giving me some type of introduction or background to my project. And so this is really setting the stage for the why we care. And as scientists, we don't always do a great job of the why do we care. Like we just want to jump in and tell you about our research and tell you about the, protein interactions you're studying or whatever it is that you're doing. But it's really important for kind of storytelling and getting your audience buy-in to make sure that you give them some introduction and background to the why do we care. And so here we always typically start with the fact that I study diabetes and I specifically study retinopathy, which is the eye disease in diabetes. So I usually start out by saying, that there's 43 million people in the US who have diabetes, and of them, 1/3 are going to have diabetic retinopathy. And so we kind of start to tell that story about why that we care about this disease that we happen to study, and we look at in the minutia, in the microvasculature in the eye. So you want to set that stage, that up. So you start out with the introduction, And then you want to give a purpose. So, what's the purpose of the study, or maybe what's your hypothesis, right? And so, for this particular project for Anne, the issue that we have is that we want to be able to count two different cell types that are involved in the capillaries that make up the capillaries, but it's really, really hard to do in mice because the mice are really tiny. And so, because of that, the morphology, which is the cell shape, is really hard to distinguish for humans in manual analysis. And so, our analysis becomes biased, it can be inaccurate, and it's also really time consuming to do this work. So, this is kind of the problem, right? This is the purpose of the study and the problem that we experience, and why that we've taken on this project in our lab to try to complete. And then we move on into what did we do? So what are the methods that we do? And so in this section of the abstract, we talk about the methods that we did. So we are creating an automated image analysis program. And so we did that using Cell Profiler, which is a free online software. And then we also developed an algorithm in our lab to be able to classify cells as either one type or the other. And so that's really our methods for this work. Typically, a lot of this happens to be a computational project in my lab, but typically we have a lot more like bench work. And so we might be describing some of those techniques, but you have to be really careful in the abstract because you have such limited space and real estate that you don't want to get into the nitty gritty of your techniques. So as an example, like I do a technique where that we isolate the vasculature that provides images that we actually use for this. And it's like a 3-day process, right? So we start out and we have to isolate the retina from the eye, and then we have to digest it in an enzyme, and then we have to do another like a water digest, and we have to do a activation solution, and those are all like 12-hour steps, right? And then finally we actually get to isolating the vessels and mounting them on the slides and then staining the slides. None of that would really be in the abstract, right? We would just say, I would say I do the elastase digestion technique to isolate the vasculature. That's it. Those super fine details could maybe go into your poster, or they might just be in your conversation and your presentation that you would give once you're at the conference. So just to kind of give perspective on how much of the method you're really going to share here in the abstract. High level. And then you want to share some of your results. And so for us, we were able to develop this new tool where that we can automate image analysis. And so that's going to be our results. And then finally, you want to conclude some type of conclusion, wrapping it up. And again, bringing us back to the why do we care? And so in this conclusion, for us, what we say, okay, we've got this new tool, and what it's going to be able to do is help us look at the disease progression of diabetic retinopathy, again, eye disease and diabetes that we study earlier on, so that hopefully we can find some therapeutics that are earlier stage to be able to move the ball forward for this type of work. So you want to connect it kind of to the broader impacts, as well as kind of that big picture of the why we care. And so that's just an overview of all of those kind of components of the abstract body. And then just a couple of guidelines to keep in mind in the abstract before we move on to the actual structure of the poster. Get started ASAP. I know this is due for those of you who are submitting for LSMRCE. This is due on the 22nd. So if you haven't started, get started. Some of you may just be refining this, so this might be a refresher or give you a couple more tips, but get started as soon as possible. Do prepare for a few rounds of edits. So your faculty mentor may want you to go back and forth with them, or your graduate student or postdoc that you're working with. They might want to go a few different times with you providing edits. And so don't be surprised by that, and don't take it personally. So I think that's really important. I remember one of the first times that I submitted writing to one of my PIs, and they just shredded it. I mean, just shredded it. And I was like, I should maybe never write science again. It was so terrible. But that's not the case. That's the process, and it's not you. And I want you to know that it's not about you, and it's not about your writing or your capabilities. It's just the process of working with faculty on these, on writing scientific writing. It's not something that you're used to. And it's this crazy, weird, dense writing that is not normal. Just to put it bluntly, it's just not normal writing. And so it takes a long time to get comfortable with that and to get to the place where that you can write it without, needing a lot of edits. And so just be prepared for that. And then I also want to point out to never, ever, ever, ever submit an abstract without the permission of your PI or your faculty mentor, the person that you did the research with. So you always need to have their, green light to be able to do that. You don't want to submit it without, because if you're working in their lab, that is the work, their work that you are going to be presenting. And so they always have to have the sign off on that. So I want to make sure to point that out. And then submit early. I already mentioned this, but things happen when it's time to submit your the portal could crash, your internet connection could go down, any number of things. You get, a call from family member and now you're not home and you can't submit it. I've had times where I'm like driving down the highway, hot spotting, trying to submit an abstract. And that is not the situation that you want to be in. You want to submit earlier than that, so you don't go through that stress and trauma or drama. So make sure that you submit early. And like I said, for LSMRC, even though it's 11:59 p.m., I would recommend that you aim for 4 p.m. And that way, if something goes wrong at 4 p.m., you've got a whole hour before IT goes home, before Deb Cole goes home, or other folks on the LSMRCE team are unavailable to answer your questions. So submit early. And then, I don't know, Diamond, do we have time? Do we want to take questions as we go, or do we want to wait till the end?
I was gonna say we could take them as we go, just in case people forget.
Yeah, because this was a lot of information. So I think before I move into the posters, I would love to take any questions that folks have, or if you have some that were submitted in advance.
Does anyone have any questions at this time? Not all at once. Alice, you can have a question. Can you come on the screen for us, or if that's not possible, that's okay.
It might be a little bright.
Okay.
Wait, Elise, it's not Alice. I'm sorry. I should have corrected you. But so is the abstract due the 22nd or the poster is due the 22nd?
The abstract.
Tell us where we're supposed to submit that, or?
Yes. So I'm going to see if Diamond can put that in the chat. From the links that I sent. But there's a whole website. LSMRC has a number of resources, a lot of which I pulled together to put together this presentation for you for their guidelines. But they've got a whole portal, and then there's a specific form for you to submit the abstract. And that's where that you have to put everything together. So we'll get that in the chat for you before the end of the session today. Any other questions before we move on to posters?
I'm going to second Winter on that because we're at a different campus. We did our summer research with IU, but we are IB Tech students currently. Do we put our abstract as IU or IB Tech?
I'm gonna say place your abstract under IU because of your all the mentors and the professors were under the IU umbrella. So you can go ahead and submit yourself as IU.
For your author affiliation, you would still do your home institution for you, even though the work was done elsewhere. Does that make sense?
Or added into the acknowledgements?
Well, the faculty that you did the research with, they would have the IU affiliation, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So that would be in the affiliation. So they would still have theirs, but then you would have yours as IB Tech, because that's your home department. You could potentially claim both, right? You could do here's my home institution and here's where the work was done. I've seen that done as well.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. What else we got? Questions here on abstracts. These are good questions when affiliations get complicated.
No other questions? Okay, I think we're okay to
All
move
right,
on
we'll
then.
keep going. We'll keep going. So let's talk about this poster. We get our, I will say, LSMRCE annual conference does have an actual abstract rubric. So make sure that you do check that out. If you earn 24 points or greater out of the 42 points, then you'll be invited to participate in the competitive poster session. And so there's a whole website that shows you what the points are and each of the categories. So you want to make sure that you take a look at that, but to make sure that you get to be entered into that competitive poster competition and accepted for the conference. So, but let's say we've been accepted, right? Yay. And we're going to find out in just a week. So on the 29th, you'll know whether or not that's been accepted. And then you can get started on your poster. And so the poster has a bunch of sections. So it's like the abstract, but even more. So we're going to have some repeats on here from the abstract, but then a bunch more sections. So you're going to have a title, authors, and affiliation. So the same as you had in your abstract, they should match exactly. So whatever you put in your abstract, that should match on the title, authors, and affiliation. So make sure that those are exactly the same as you list them in your abstract submission. Some folks like to include their abstract in their poster, but that is optional because typically you're going to have an abstract book that gets disseminated. It's either going to be in print or a QR code. These days, lots of them are QR codes where that you can access the PDF online. And so the abstract will be available to folks if they did want to read it. So because the poster is a small space, it's not small, they're big, but it's still small real estate wise, that you might not want to use up that real estate on the abstract when it's going to be published elsewhere. And some conferences may require that you do that. Again, know that information from the conference to make sure that you know whether or not it has to be included. From what I saw in the example posters for LSMRCE, including the abstract on the poster is not required. So that's a stylistic choice that you can make. You're going to include introduction and background. You're going to want to share, again, the why we care and any information that, somebody who's coming to your poster would need to know to understand your project. This can be text, it can be figures, it could be a combination of both. And so that's, again, up to you to kind of decide what, how much text you want versus images and things like that. But you want to give enough background that really somebody could follow along within what's going to come for why you chose to do the methods and pursue this project that you pursued. The methods, again, is going to outline the what you did. And here it could be a combination. It could be figures. It could be text. It could be both of those things. So that's a choice that you'll have to make. I will recommend BioRender is a free website that you can use that makes some really amazing graphics for science. And so the students in my lab use it, and they just really have these phenomenal presentations, both posters and oral, for being able to show their methodology that they do. So definitely check that out, biorender.com. Then you're going to include your results. That's going to be your figures, right? That's where you're figure heavy. You're going to be primarily figures and figure legends in your results. You're not going to have other text besides explaining what those figures are. So those might be images, those might be graphs, there might be tables that you include. And so that's going to be what's going to be found in the results section. And then you'll have some type of conclusion or discussion, up to you which one of those you want to call it. But that's going to be wrapping it up. Like, what did we find from this study? What can we think about going forward? How do we wrap this project up? And sometimes folks ask for a societal impact statement. That's optional unless the conference specifically requires it. So we have Embry in Oklahoma, and their conferences, they always require that. So often our posters in my lab have that because we get funding through them. But that may be something that you want to include, which is kind of like a broader impacts type statement. So how does this relate back to like the larger scope, the larger field that you're interested in studying? So super, super zoomed out perspective. You may want to include future directions, but that also could just be a talking point that you have during your presentation. Again, that's kind of an optional one. References is pretty standard that you would include that. So you want to include any papers that you've kind of cited throughout your poster. You don't have to make specific citations to them, but you want to have them listed in there. And you want to make sure that you use consistent formatting for those, whether that's APA style, MLA style, or whatever it may be that's appropriate for your field. And then lastly, those acknowledgements and funding. Again, anybody who maybe contributed to the project who's not an author, and then any funding sources. And of course, NSF and Indiana LSAMP are going to be on there, as well as maybe some others from your specific lab or research group. And so I pulled one of my students' posters to put on here. This was a project that we did on a 3D print that we made a model of the capillaries, a 3D model of the capillaries. And this is kind of the standard that we have in my lab. We do kind of 3 columns just to kind of point out some different pieces before I go through all of those different components. So up at the top is that title section with the authors and the affiliations. We also do cute logos. So I love a cute logo. You could throw the NSF logo on it, the Indiana LSAMP logo on it, your school logo, or if you have a lab logo. So this is our school, a portion of our school logo. And then my lab has its own logo, so we usually include that on our posters. My school's colors are green, so that's why that the poster's green. I don't have a particular affinity for green, but that's why that it is. And then we have 3 columns. So usually the left-hand column for us is going to be introduction. Sometimes introduction and methods we'll put over there, depending on the project. In the center column, we usually include methods and the results. Again, if the methods come over to the left-hand column, then we'll have even more space for the results. And you see that that section is really the widest. So I'm giving the most attention and focus to that section of the poster. And then our third column over on the right-hand side is those conclusions or discussions, societal impact statement, in this case, references and acknowledgements. And some things to keep in mind are font size and things like that. You can see my references are real small because I don't have a lot of space for them, and I'm trying to cram as much as I can possibly into this poster. Typically, I would say I try not to have the font go smaller than about 18 or 20 on a poster. And so that's what these are probably 18 here in the center and on the sides, with the exception of the references. The references are probably a true 12, which is really small for a poster. So just to keep in mind that once you blow it up, that font can get really, really small. And so 18 or 20 is probably the smallest that you really want to go for the bulk of your poster. And you also want to be careful with your images that you don't stretch them. So make sure that you lock your aspect ratio. That's going to be your width and your height. Make sure that you lock those so that you don't end up making your images a little like wonky. That happens often in making posters. Also just for sizes. So the posters for LSMRCE can be 3 foot by 4 foot. That's the maximum size. I think you can go either direction from kind of the examples that they have provided on their website. So you could either do 4 feet wide, 3 feet tall, or you could go 4 feet tall, 3 foot wide. But make sure that you confirm that with your coordinator before you go make that poster, because resizing is awful. really, really awful to reformat these things. I'm telling you, I just did one for this conference in DC, and it was miserable to reformat the sizing. It's really, really hard and takes just a considerable amount of time. And so the way that you set up the poster size, and so usually you make these, you create them in PowerPoint. And so your lab may have a template. So ask your PI or your faculty mentor, ask them if they have a template, or ask your program coordinator if they have a template, because it's nice to have that to kind of jump off of. But to make sure that you get the right size when you're in PowerPoint, you would go to page setup, which I think is an edit. I think you go edit or file, I can't remember. And then you do page setup, and then you can set the dimensions. And so then if you were aiming for 4 feet wide, then you would say width 48 inches. And then if you're doing 3 foot tall, you do 36 inches in height. And so you want to make sure that you get that scaling right for making sure that it's all going to print correctly. And then now I'll just kind of point out some of these, I think they're obvious at this point because they're all labeled, but I'll point out the components of this. So we have, again, at the top, we've got our title, authors, and affiliations, and we're matching up exactly what we put into our abstract. We have the same components where we've got the superscripts for the different affiliations shown for each of the authors. We've got our introduction that's going to tell us some of the background. You can see in this one, it's a mixture of text and images. So these images are really important for the work that we're doing, as well as showing the visual loss that happens in retinopathy. So we show that. We've got our methods, and here my lab they like photos. And so here we've got an image representation of kind of our steps. This is the process of how that we get to our 3D print. And so they've shown that representatively with images as well as a text description below it. You could do either or. And then our results, again, that's going to be figures and figure legends for each of those. And this is this portion is actually this is like Tetris. If you enjoy Tetris, this is going to be your jam. So getting your figures to all fit and be able to fit in the figure legends is like this giant Tetris game. And so it takes some serious skill to do that. You can see in this one, we ended up with a slightly weird gap. I probably would want to fix that if we had more time. But sometimes you're just like, listen, we gotta submit this poster. So you have to kind of work through it and see how to best represent things and get lots of feedback from other people. Our conclusions are over on our right-hand side for this particular poster. Societal impact statement. Again, that's one of those optional ones. References, and again, I make them real tiny. That's a stylistic choice that I make, but because I'd rather sacrifice those than the rest of the space. And then lastly, those acknowledgements. So folks who've given us funding. In this case, the only funding source actually was our department. And then you can actually see there were several folks that I thanked for supporting this project. So we had a number of folks of Oklahoma School for the Blind, as well as a couple of members of my lab who helped with this project, but were not super involved with it the way that the authors that are listed there were. Okay. A couple of just things to think about for your background on these. If you use a really dark background and a light text, it is very hard for your audience to read. It's very harsh on the eyes, and it will make them work a little too hard to pay attention. And the same is true if you go with a really light colored background as well as light colored text. So it takes us a second to even adjust to trying to read this text that's on the screen. And so we don't want to do that. We want to have a good amount of contrast between what the background is, whether that's white with dark text or whether it's, a slightly other color with a darker text on top of it. But we don't want to do the extremes where we make it hard for our audience to follow along. So I'll pause there and see if we have any questions just on the general format for our posters before we talk a little bit about presenting.
Any
I just have
questions?
a question about the abstract portion for the acknowledgements.
Yes.
Are we supposed to include the directors of the LSAMP names in the acknowledgements, or just our PI and mentor?
Your PI would typically be one of the co-authors, so they should probably be listed as one of your co-authors as long as they are fine with that. That's a good question, Diamond. Thoughts about being acknowledged in the acknowledgement sections for the abstract?
Hi,
I'm
this
sorry, repeat the question one more time for me.
Diamond, this is Kim. My answer is no. The director of the LSAM project had nothing to do with your scholarship. Present your research finding. So those you acknowledge are the contributor, which is your faculty mentor, your lab partner, and people who contribute to your work.
Yes, I agree, Kim. I agree, Kim. Good question. What else?
Anyone
Question
else?
on posters or abstracts so far?
Okay.
We'll talk about presenting. All right. So, a couple of things just to think about your presentation and the type of presentation that you all are going to be doing as posters. So we don't have to think too much about that, but you want to think about what the purpose of that talk is. So when we're thinking about the LSMRCE conference, you're going to be judged during this during the presentation. So you're going to have at least 3 judges that will come around and judge you. And so, the hope is that you're going to do a really great job and score well, but also that you want to talk about your research, right? And so, so you want to think about the purpose of the talk. So sometimes we do talks that are just like progress updates. Sometimes we do talks that are more like complete stories. And so, when you're doing an LSMRC annual conference, it's probably going to look a little more like a complete story. You're going to try to make it as complete as you possibly can. And you also want to think about your knowledge and comfort with the material, and remember that you are actually going to be the expert on this project. And I know that's hard to believe when you're an undergrad, but really, you know this project better than anybody else who's going to come to your poster and talk to you. And so make sure that you remember that you are that expert, even though it can be really scary sometimes to present. You also want to think about what are those take-home points that you want for folks to know after they've been to your poster. So try to come up with 3 main points that you want them to remember. And those can be things that you might repeat, or you might start out by kind of hinting that that's what you're going to talk about, and then talk about those things and then remind them in the conclusions, right? So that they're like, oh, they really, knew what they were talking about. And these were the things that they wanted me to come away from this presentation knowing. You also want to think about that audience. And so the poster session is like one of the most challenging, I think, presentations out there. So typically you're going to have a window of, an hour or 2 hours that you stand at this poster. Anybody can walk by and ask you about your poster, right? So that could be, a peer. It could be a high school student, or it could be another college student who's coming by. It could be a graduate student. It could be a faculty member. It could be it could be LSAMP directors, right? Any number of folks that could come by. And so, you have to think about who that audience is. Is it your peer, or is it the faculty, or is it some combination? And you kind of have to be ready to adapt your talk to whoever stops by. So sometimes you can do a little bit of gauging in your initial talking about that introduction to see how much do they know, or you could ask them some questions about their, interest or background and understanding of whatever the topic is that you happen to study. And so you can get a little bit of an idea of where they're at so that you can start tailoring that talk. Typically when I do a poster, I might even ask them, like, are you looking for the 2-minute, the 5-minute, or the 10-minute version, right? Because some folks are just passing by and they're like, you're by yourself and I feel sad for you, so I'm going to stop and talk to you. And sometimes they're like, I read the abstract book and your research is so interesting, and like, it's aligned with what I do. And like, I really want to hear about the work that you're doing. Right. And so it's hard to know that because they're just passing by and you may not know them at all. And so you can do a little bit of that work in the initial kind of description of your research to get an idea of where that they stand. But also be prepared to have this kind of different versions of your presentation depending on the audience. And then I always say it's important to zoom out and put yourself into those audience's shoes. So the first thing you need to do is get buy-in, right? You have to make sure that your audience cares about what you're talking about. And so the zoom out part of that is to really get to the why do we care? So my lab studies, we study two cells. We study pericytes and endothelial cells. They make up the capillaries, and we study them in the retinas, in the eyes of mice. Who cares? Right. And so we have to get the audience to care. And so we have to start out with diabetes as like a disease that affects 10% of the population globally, right? In the US and globally, and affects minorities even more significantly. And then we have to talk about, well, did you know that there's this complication that comes with diabetes that affects the eyes that actually causes 10% of diabetics to go blind? It's the leading cause of blindness in adults working age adults, right? Who knew, right? And so you start building this story, building this narrative of why do we care before I tell you about these two cell types that you never knew about and never cared about, right? And so you have to get that buy-in from your audience. And so you really have to zoom out, and that's hard to do in science because we're like, let me tell you about my science and how cool it is and the experiments I did and the results I got. But you've got to take a step back, make sure that they're following along with you so that they will stay with you for that presentation. So thinking about that method of presentation here, we're going to have a poster presentation. And so that's going to be really your visual, that you have that poster that you're going to be able to point to and show the different pieces of your research. You might want to think about whether, the poster typically is going to be didactic, but there are ways that you can kind of bring in participation if you're up for that challenge. Notes, I always say use sparingly or not at all. Not at all is better. But if you have to, really sparingly. So I've seen folks who have note cards and they're just reading one after the other, or just reading the poster while they're talking to their audience. And so you don't want that to be you. Practice, 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 so that isn't you when you do get to that conference. If you want to give a handout, I always recommend that you do that at the end, because otherwise they're going to be reading the handout or looking at the handout instead of listening to you. So make sure that you don't do that until the end. And so something you may consider doing is actually printing out your poster on a sheet of paper. So you can print that out and have that available to give out to folks who stop by your poster. This is actually the poster that I'm presenting while I'm here in DC. And then on the back of it, I have my references because I didn't have any space for it. And then I have my contact information so that then they could contact me. You could also pair that with a business card so that way you can hand that out and they could reach out to you, and you've got those two things together. So they're like, this is the poster and this is the person, so that they can follow up with you. So you might consider doing that so that you can stay in touch with folks who are interested in your project, or potential people. Maybe the grad school fair folks are walking around and you want them to remember you and reach out to you, right? So these are good tools. You could give those handouts again at the end after you've finished giving your presentation. Let's skip this one. So again, you want to think about the emphasis of your presentation. What are those main points that you want your audience to walk away with? And so you want to make sure that you hit those points, hit them again. And so they really think this person knew what they were talking about. A trick that my dissertation advisor actually told me is that if you repeat yourself, the second time you say it, your audience is like, oh yeah, I knew that. And so now your audience thinks that like they're in on the secret, and they also feel smarter. And so it's okay to repeat yourself, especially if you have certain talking points that you're like, I want them to know this by the end of the talk. And so by repeating yourself, then you're actually like building that buy-in, and they're like, oh, we're in this club together. Like we both know this. And so it's completely okay to repeat yourself. Okay. You do want to think about the flow. Typically, we go kind of in the order that we've been talking about for all of these components for the abstract and for the poster. You start with the intro, you talk about the methods. You might do some combination of methods and results. You might talk about like, this is the technique I did, and then here's the results. And then here's the other, like the next technique or method that I did, and here's the results from that. So you don't do all the methods together and then all the results together. So you might walk them through. There's a little bit of back and forth that could happen there to kind of help with the flow of the talk. And then you'll talk about those conclusions or future directions. And then you'll have time for Q&A, which is always the dreaded portion of any presentation, I think, especially when you're at the undergrad stage. I know it's hard, and we can talk about tips for that too. You do want to practice this, make sure you time yourself so you know how long it takes to do these presentations and what the pacing is, how much time you're dedicating to each section. So you don't want, typically, if you're doing a poster session that's going to be judged, 5 minutes is the norm for what you're going to aim for. And so you don't want 3 of those minutes to be dedicated to the introduction before you ever get to what you did, right? So you want to think about and have somebody time you, or you time yourself and say, okay, after my introduction, I'm going to stop the timer, see how many minutes I've gone. Now, after the methods, how many minutes have I gone, right? So you want to know that, yes, you got to the 5 minutes and didn't go over, but how much are you dedicating to each portion? And really the majority of your time should be spent on the methods and the results. And then also make sure you have enough time to do some kind of conclusion, wrap it up, bring it all together for the audience, and then allow time for Q&A. So usually it's 5 minutes for the presentation and then 1 to 2 minutes for those questions and answers after. And then just a delivery checklist as you think about your presentation. Make sure that you're connecting with that audience, you're keeping them the whole way through, engaged and getting their buy-in. Breathe. Don't just speed through a presentation. Make sure that you breathe, and make sure you're also paying attention to your body and having some control over that. And also your gestures. You want to make sure your hands aren't all wonky and crazy, because that's real distracting for your audience. But that you're using those gestures to point to specific things as you go through your talk. Try to have steady speech. I know that can be really challenging when you're nervous and you're like, high anxiety or anxiousness, right? That can be tough, but that's why practicing in advance will help. You want to make sure that you dress professionally. So, you want to be business or business casual for presenting at a conference. So you want to, wear something nice, like a button-up shirt or a blazer or, whatever, sport coat, and for women, blouses or any of those things that I already said, or blouses or dresses with blazers. That's my go-to personally, is a dress and a blazer, but something professional. And if you're not sure, ask your director. Like, you can send them a picture of your outfit. This is what I'm planning to wear. What do you think? Or stop by their office, and they are going to be more than happy to help you. And then be enthusiastic, because that's really contagious. When somebody is super excited about their research, like, you can tell, and it comes through. And so that enthusiasm is really infectious. And so make sure that you're excited, because then the judges will be excited, and the other folks that stop by your post will be excited for you. And then just to really make it memorable, make sure you're telling a story, right? You're walking them through this story that seems cohesive. Be accessible. Don't use crazy jargon just to use jargon. Make sure that it's, that it's a language that other people can follow. If you have acronyms, as much as you can just say the full name, it's better. My lab, so diabetic retinopathy, is abbreviated DR, and they'll say DR, DR, DR. And I'm like, nobody knows what that is, like, right? And so I'm like, just say diabetic retinopathy. Like, yes, it's a bazillion syllables, but we want to make sure that our audience is following us and that we don't get lost in acronyms. And so make sure that your talk is accessible. And then give a great delivery, and then this will be your audience. They're going to be cheering for you. They're going to be so excited for you. They might not clap like that, but they're going to be excited for you. There's no clapping at poster sessions. And with that, I'll take any other questions you may have about presenting or anything else that we covered today. And as you think about getting ready for LSMRC annual conference.
Okay, do we have any final questions for Dr. Valdez about anything we talked about this evening?
How did you say, where do we go again for like the rubric for the abstract?
Yeah, let me see
Okay.
if I can get our chat going.
So if you look at the top of the chat, we have several links.
They won't be able to see them, Diamond, because I put them in whenever before, but I'm just going to paste them in.
Okay, that's
So
fine. Also, really quickly, I can just go over, can I share my screen, Dr. Valdez, or do you still have?
sure. Yeah,
Okay.
go for it.
All right. So this page right here is the LSMRCE page for the conference. So literally you can just type in lsmrce.org and you'll go to events and annual conference, and this will pop right up. So it has several things for you to click on here. The agenda is here. Call for abstracts is where the students will go to actually submit their abstract. So this second one where it says poster sessions for undergraduate and graduate STEM students, you will click on that and it has everything you need. So it has timelines and deadlines, requirements, guides and rubrics, some information about, or some additional resources. They have some poster examples here. Again, all the guidelines and rubrics. They even have a YouTube video from a former webinar, looks like they did back in 2020 as an example as well. So if you go to just simply LSMRCE in their annual conference page, you'll have everything you will need.
Yes. It's really comprehensive. Like most conferences don't have nearly this amount of resources. So do utilize them. I put in the chat a bunch of the different like parsed out links, but they do all stem from the LSMRCE events page. So there's the conference details, the poster details, the abstracts, and then the rubric, as well as one of the three. They actually have 3 different abstract examples for you on that website.
Right, and it also has kind of like what is required to participate. So it tells you to submit your abstract. It'll tell you when you'll receive your RSVP for participation, and then what you need to bring in person, as well as the time of the actual presentations itself. Right below that is the actual submission form. So you click on that and this pops up to where you put all your information and you upload your abstract. Acknowledge your funders, acknowledge everybody you need to. I don't believe most of you will have to worry about the travel award. That'll kind of be once we see who gets accepted and who doesn't. So for the most part, we'll take care of that. Do we have any other questions? Okay.
Quiet group.
All right, well, if we don't have any other questions, I want to say thank you to everyone for coming this evening. Again, that deadline is Friday, so please remember. I'm sure your coordinators will be getting on to you probably around Wednesday or Thursday. So just go ahead and take care of that and you won't have anything to worry about. All right, if we don't have anything further, everyone is dismissed. Thank you so much for coming. And everyone have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cammi.
You bet. Thanks for coming.